Episode 2, a deep dive into Diddy. Did he do it? Did he done it? But not all of it. And what kind of sentencing did he get from doing it? Hi, this is Angela McGuire, and welcome to the Crosstown Traffic Podcast, the intersection of politics, legal, culture, and public perception, where our headline collides with the deeper question, and we cut across the noise to arrive at the truth and what really matters. For those of you who like the details, who want to nerd out on this case and find out what really happened and why he got the sentencing that he got, it's not because he was a celebrity. He did have a crack legal team that really messed it up for the prosecution, for the overzealous prosecution with their beloved RICO. We'll go into this, and we will go into government overreach. Sure, we love Diddy. Maybe not. But the thing is, we don't like government overreach, especially when it pertains to what we do behind closed doors in the privacy of our own bedrooms or hotel rooms in this case. The P. Diddy trial is over, but we are still taking a deep dive into the Diddy case. Sentencing comes tomorrow, July 8th, 2025. If you've been following the headlines, you probably think you know this case. But what I've seen from inside the courtroom tells a much more complicated story. The way this case has been portrayed in the media is one thing, but sitting in that courtroom, and I saw just about all of the trial. I heard the evidence, the testimony, and all that paints a very different picture, especially upon cross-examination. Just for your information, the defense did not bring any witnesses. Why? Because upon cross-examination, their testimonies didn't stand up, and it actually became a hostile witness to the prosecution. So the prosecution's own witnesses did not stand. That became evident maybe week 4. If you listen to my podcast or watch my other podcasts, I explain how systematically and brilliantly one of the prosecutors basically dismantled the evidence, or the testimony was very contradictory. It was a masterclass in how one does this. So please check out my other podcast. Now, it's interesting that although the members of the mainstream media were also in attendance here, I saw them, some of them simply did not change their story. They did not change it when they saw the poor witness testimony or the cross-examination dismantle the evidence or the witnesses. They did not change their story upon contradictory statements upon cross-examination by the defense. It seems that at one point, when the narrative was shifting, you would have expected the media reporters who were there to see this actually changed their narrative. But no, they hired somebody who was an outsider who was not inside the courtroom to make a legal analysis of how Sean P. Diddy Combs was actually going to be convicted of a RICO. Once you see my analysis, you will understand how preposterous and actually funny, in a sad way, that is. It just seems like the, mainstream media just wanted to maintain their initial narrative, which was reflective of the prosecution, and at some points they even doubled down. But as you will see in my analysis, they were proven wrong. It's a good thing that we have the ability to have the public come in to observe these trials. Now, RICO. How does RICO apply to Sean Combs' case? So, how did the RICO play out in the case against Sean Combs? Well, prosecutors alleged that Combs wasn't just a music mogul. They claimed he was running a criminal enterprise with his personal assistants acting as foot soldiers, booking hotels, arranging escorts, and even carrying drugs. They brought 8 predicate acts against him. Boom. Kidnapping. Arson. That would be number 2. 3, forced labors. 4, sex trafficking. 5, Mann Act violations. 6, bribery. 7, witness tampering. And 8, drug possession with the intent to distribute. Drug kingpin Sean Combs, right? But here's the key. To make RICO stick, they only needed 2 of these to hold up in court. Well, good luck with that. Anyway, let's see, breaking down the charges. Now, we want to look at these charges. In order to do a deep dive, we have to break down the charges. For each charge, the government offered witness testimony, text messages, and video evidence. But Diddy's defense team came prepared. So let's look at the predicate acts. Because, the government wants to get this guy. So let's look at this. How do you get John Diddy Combs on kidnapping? So the government's story started with Capricorn Clark, one of Combs' longtime assistants. They claim that she was held against her will for 5 days, forced to undergo repeated polygraph tests after jewelry went missing from the office. But here's what really happened. The fuller context, not the cherry picking. The government cherry picked. This is an example of how P. Diddy's lawyers put everything into perspective, as it should be. So this is what really happened. Capricorn was a respected, hardworking assistant. When some jewelry disappeared, she locked the doors to the office to make sure no one left until it was found. Despite searches, the jewelry never showed up. Management decided everyone should take polygraphs to clear themselves, and including Capricorn. She didn't refuse. In fact, she volunteered. She didn't have to, but she did. For 5 days straight, she submitted to these tests. Perhaps she was nervous. Why would you need to take it more than once? But in any event, for 5 days straight, she submitted to the tests. But here's the key. Each day she left at 5 p.m. She wasn't locked in. She wasn't under threat. She was just trying to clear her name through the polygraph tests. Last time I heard, when you are kidnapped, you don't get to go home at 5 o'clock. You don't get to go home at all. You are detained. You cannot get out of the premises. So, this is faulty evidence. The prosecution also pointed to Cassie, alleging she was held at the London Hotel in Los Angeles after an altercation with Combs. The thing is, Combs beat the shit out of her, stamped on her face, and she got bruises. So Combs did not want her to be seen in public with bruises. So they hold her up in a hotel. But the defense also said that D-Rock, who was Combs' security and friend of Cassie's, stayed with her. Now, allegedly, he was to prevent her from leaving, but basically, they were both chilling out. She had her phone. She could have called hotel security, if she felt that she was being detained by D-Rock. Essentially, she could have left any time, is what I'm saying, and is what the defense says as well. So basically, she wasn't kidnapped. She was holed up in a hotel at P. Diddy's assistance, and he was paying for it, and I'm sure it didn't suck. The London Hotel in Los Angeles. Look it up, check it out. But this wasn't kidnapping. It was, at worst, a poor attempt to manage a volatile situation. So, verdict, not guilty. Act 2, arson. Because, what's a RICO without arson, right? I saw Goodfellas. There was arson in that. There's a big, huge explosion. So come on, let's go with arson, because I'm sure that was in all the other RICO charges with the mob, right? So in any event, there was the allegation that Combs torched Kid Cudi's car. Prosecutors say jealousy over Cassie's relationship with Cudi drove Combs crazy, and it caused him to send a message by setting Cudi's car on fire. But the defense shredded this claim. Basically, Capricorn Clark testified to a wild story about a car chase that, according to Officer Ignacio and Cudi himself, never happened. So this just reduces any credibility that Capricorn Clark could have ever said regarding this incident. Anyway, no fingerprints tied Combs to the scene. The DNA from a glove was partial, it was inconclusive, and it essentially pointed to a woman, not Combs. So Cassie did say after the fact that she recalls Combs having said something to the effect of sending either an email or a text message, but it said, "I will hurt you." And then she says, "Oh yeah, and he said he'd be on vacation when it happened." He happened to be on vacation when that Molotov cocktail was thrown on Kid Cudi's car. But again, there's a lot of reasonable doubt here. I mean, let's face it. Does it even make sense? The guy was out of town, and unless there's some firm evidence, it is hearsay, and hearsay after the fact based on what Cassie's testimony was. But in any event, Agnifilo, Combs's lead attorney in the case, during his closing arguments, leaned over to the jury in his folksy way, and he just basically, Combs is a man's man, the kind of guy who would settle things with a fist fight, not a Molotov cocktail. Well, he sure proved that with Cassie. He beat the shit out of her, and more times than once. So anyway, he's a fist fight kind of guy. So maybe Agnifilo has a point. The whole point in his job is really to cast doubt, and that certainly does cast doubt. So 1 point for the defense. But anyway, getting back to this, ultimately there was no solid defense, and there was no surveillance cameras, no confession, just stories, just hearsay, and of course the audio message. So anyway, there you go. So much for the arson charge. I know the prosecution probably saw the movie Goodfellas and thought, hey, we can get a RICO, we need an arson charge. Well, that arson charge was pretty undermined. There was no evidence, no credible evidence. It's a shame that Kid Cudi's car was caught on fire, but we don't know who did it. So verdict, not guilty of arson. Okay, Predicate Act 3, forced labor. The forced labor charge centered on Mia, a young assistant eager to impress her boss in her first basically second big entertainment job. She testified that during her first week, she worked 5 days straight without sleep until she finally broke down crying, at which point Diddy demanded that she go home and get some rest. I don't think it's forced labor if you ask your employee to go home and get some sleep. I just don't think that. But that's not how forced labor works usually. But in any event, later Mia did claim that she felt pressured into sexual encounters with Combs, and she was afraid that she'd lose her job if she refused. But she never told him no, and never told Cassie about these encounters either. She should have at least told Combs no if she didn't want his advances. In this case, Combs did commit sexual harassment at the workplace because he was her boss, she was his subordinate or his employee. He should not have done it, and I'm sure he knew better. Anyway, Mia finally settled with Combs for a few $100,000, but it had more to do with back pay or work hours or something to that effect. And it had nothing to do with any sexual harassment charges, which I'm sure had she pursued, she would have gotten more like millions instead of hundreds of thousands. But she said that as far as the sexual advances go, when she was on the witness stand, she said she was not going to tell anybody about it and she would just take it to her grave in silence. But she was subpoenaed, she was granted immunity, and guess what? She mentions it on the stand, but she also went under a pseudonym. Her name is not Mia. Her real name is not Mia, and it was not disclosed. I feel sorry for Mia because she was crying on the stand, so she was traumatized by Diddy's advances, and I think she should have spoken out and been stronger, maybe now with the Me Too movement, and as she's 10 years older than at the time, you live, you learn. But in any event, she also seemed to have a lot of admiration and love for Combs. For his 45th birthday, she created a card which is quite beautiful and nostalgic. It had clippings from all kinds of magazines on his rise to success and fame. And it was a nostalgic tribute, and I'm sure it took a long time to make. So it was made with love. And it's the front page they did show in the court, and it's really cool. And I'm sure he's very proud of getting something like that from an employee, no less. I think that's a wonderful gesture. And it seems like all of these relationships, at least the ones who in his inner circle that pertain to Combs' enterprise, his job or his business, seems like Combs' relationships are all very close, very tight-knit, and also operating in shades of gray. We always have to remember that. Shades of gray is something that characterizes Combs' enterprises, his activities, his hot temper, that leads to his, beating the crap out of people. Also, we cannot overlook his drug use. He was taking drugs every day. And if you are a drug addict, which I believe at the time he was, it kind of affects your ability to think straight. It might affect your emotional state. And it might not help you diffuse situations. It might also affect impulse control, which is an issue here. The other thing is, let's take a deeper dive into the legal component here of forced labor with regard to sex. So under Title 17 of the United States Code, or under 18 U.S.C. Section 1589, forced labor, prosecutors must show the defendant knowingly obtained labor or services, including sexual services, by means of force or threats of serious harm, physical restraint, abuse of legal process, or by means of any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the victim to believe that they would suffer harm if they didn't comply. So this is conspiracy, the whole scheming and planning part. The services, and that's in quotes, can include sexual acts, especially when connected to fear of job loss or other consequences. But here's why the defense dismantled it in the Diddy case. Mia never testified to explicit threats or restraint. Her fear of job loss was implied, not stated. She stayed employed for years after the alleged encounters. So also, we have to take into consideration what the judge's jury instructions were. And he reminded the jury to consider Mia's age, education, stage in life, her work experience, and her experience when assessing the coercion. So think about her as a whole person, how sophisticated she might be, what her experiences have been. Mia was 25 when she started working for Diddy. She was well educated and had prior experience working for another celebrity. She wasn't an inexperienced teenager without agency. She had agency. She stayed employed in Combs Enterprises for years, and when she left, she was so distraught that she had to call Christina, KK Courtroom, Combs' chief of staff. She had to talk her down from feeling suicidal, and that is pretty deep. So she must have gotten terminated somehow and felt suicidal. That's awful. But again, the close-knit nature of the relationships in this organization enabled Mia, even though she felt suicidal, she felt that she could actually call KK, and KK was kind enough to talk to her. And there is something to be said about that. A lot of the people are nice. They're serving. They seem like good people, I guess. So since the jury instructions reminded them to consider Mia's age, education, and life stage, the verdict resulted in not guilty. She had enough agency. She could have told him to lay off, and she didn't. So, Act 4, sex trafficking. The sex trafficking was the charge the prosecutors were betting on. They painted Combs as a man running freak-offs, hotel nights, group sex parties with escorts, assistants arranging logistics, and girlfriends coerced with drugs and financial dependency. In closing arguments, Combs' lead attorney, Mark Agnifilo, countered with the fact that Combs and Cassie were basically swingers. Now, being a swinger is different from being a sex trafficker. All they wanted to do was have kinky sex and have escorts there. They weren't really running a big, elaborate organization, and I think this needs to be emphasized. So, Cassie's texts, in some cases, were very explicit, very passionate, and far from the language of a victim. She talked about how much she loved him. She talked about how much she liked the freak-offs, and she was very graphic and salacious, and talked about how horny she was, and all that stuff. So it looks like they kind of met their match when you think about it, because not everybody wants to do that kind of stuff. And another text Kathy had sent, it included that she appreciated Combs, she loved him very much, she appreciated being part of his life, and she just loved being around him, even when they weren't doing anything at all. She just felt that she learned a lot by being with him. And that's just not the words of somebody who has been coerced. It was a very loving text if you were to read it. And I just don't think she had Stockholm Syndrome. I think she truly loved Diddy, and he loved her in return. And they were in a relationship for 10 years. That can't be ignored. So the thing is, they were in love, but I think they also had a very dysfunctional relationship in terms of the beatings. But at the same time, for example, after that infamous hotel beating, Cassie did send a text message a few days later saying, those are some bad drugs. You had a bad trip. So that implies that she realizes that that was probably out of character for him, and the beatdown, maybe that was something that they didn't normally do. Let's hope so. So if you look at that text message, it really undoes a lot of the damage that the video at the hotel does. I mean, it's still very damaging, but it does put some of the things in context, especially in the form of coercion and battery. So that's something to think about. Now, the other thing is, when it came to Jane, Agnifilo acknowledged a romantic date invitation that turned into a hotel night with an escort. So essentially, P. Diddy lied to Jane, told her he was going to take her out on a proper date, which got her to get ready, jump in an airplane, go from Los Angeles to New York, only to find out it was going to be a hotel night, and she was not pleased with this. She wanted a romantic date. She always seemed like she wanted to have more of a relationship with Diddy, be his girlfriend, be his girlfriend in public, maybe have a real relationship. A lot of women were interested in him. But again, this was more of a transactional relationship as well. Sometimes they were together, sometimes they were apart because she was upset with the hotel nights and things not going her way. So to me, this demonstrates agency. Another time was they got into a fight, but it was a fight that she started because she was jealous of another one of Diddy's girlfriends who was younger than him. So it came to this crazy fight, and then finally, towards the end or at the end of it, he had kicked in her doors. I mean, it was just ridiculous. He winds up giving her an ecstasy pill, and they wind up having a freak off. They had called somebody, and then they go on and do that. So I don't know, maybe she felt coerced. I don't know, maybe she was just on drugs, but this whole thing just sounds really strange. My assessment of Jane is that she's essentially a groupie who expected to be paid. And at one point in a text message, Sean says, look, I'm doing my job. Actually, it's more like a voice message. Sean says, I'm doing my job, and I expect you to do your job. That implies that he's paying her rent. He's giving her gifts and things like that, paying for her travel. but he expects something in return, and that would be in the form of hotel nights, because that is basically what their relationship was based on. So the thing is, another message he left her was, well, I hope you like that roof over your head and you have a nice smile, implying that he was paying her rent and he also paid for her veneers so she could have a beautiful mouth of beautiful teeth, which she has, I'm sure. So the thing is, it was a transactional relationship, and we have to acknowledge that. Oftentimes when he was talking about freak-offs and what he wanted her to do, she would start to bring up the topic of money or material things that she wanted. So clearly, that implies that I'll do those things you want for the hotel night, but you've got to pay me. And that was implied based on the various text messages that we were privy to, as well as some recorded phone calls. So anyway, the verdict on the sex trafficking was, I guess, partial. I don't know. It didn't really stick because you have to have 2 charges or 2 counts per charge. Perhaps it was this one instance of fraud when he lied to her to get her to do the hotel night and she did it reluctantly. So I guess 1 count. So fraud, sex trafficking by fraud. But when you think about it, there's so many guys out there that are just lying to women to get them in bed. So you guys better be careful. Maybe you should sign a contract. Anyway, the Mann Act. Mann Act violations. So the Mann Act makes it illegal to transport someone across state lines for prostitution. So prosecutors showed flight records and hotel receipts for Cassie, Jane, and the escorts, but these trips were often arranged by Cassie or Jane, even Combs or Combs' assistants, and all the expenses always came from Combs' personal funds. And that's an important distinction because it did not come from Combs' enterprise or his business, the operating income of his business. It actually came from him personally. So with respect to the RICO charge, it kind of deflates the RICO charge. Had he gotten monies from the operations of the organization, it might have strengthened it a little, but I don't think it was enough. It would never be enough to charge him. But anyway, he paid for everything out of pocket. The other thing that Agnifilo reminded the jury that the nature of Diddy's business was not an enterprise profiting from sex work. It was a celebrity's private life. It was not a drug distribution ring. He just liked drugs. He was a drug addict. So some of the assistants may have made hotel reservations, may have gotten drugs for him, but it was hardly a pattern. It was very random. It was ad hoc. No way. But basically, what I've just described was not a conspiracy. It was just a group of random acts. So this guy could, basically hire an escort to essentially do live porn, which I understand in Los Angeles is a thing people do. I guess people are sick of just regular porn by watching it on their TV. So now they have to go to the next level, which is to hire an escort and film your girlfriend doused in baby oil for the effect of having glistening, glimmering skin. Maybe Diddy should just get a porn license and do that. That way he avoids all of this questions, speculation, drug trafficking, all the madness. And he knows about lighting and baby oil at this point, so people will probably find his videos probably very seductive and enticing. And there again, you have somebody who is a music and entertainment mogul figuring out how to be entertaining in people's private lives in their bedrooms through their filmed, not the live stuff. I think you have to be pretty rich to attract that kind of thing, and also pretty damn kinky. So it's just weird. Some of these people are just weird. No wonder they call it Holly Weird for a reason. The other thing about celebrities, it's not unusual for celebrities to have assistants doing a variety of personal errands, in addition to work-oriented errands. So I think this is pretty common knowledge, and we need to not go into too much detail here. But bottom line, with regard to the Mann Act, it was actually found 2 counts of the Mann Act. One with trafficking Jane, I guess the one to New York, and another with Cassie. But it was only one offense. That is why he didn't get the RICO. Now, the predicate acts of bribery and witness tampering. Let's talk about bribery and the hallway video. So prosecutors claimed that Sean Combs bribed hotel security at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles, where that horrible beatdown video took place, in order to suppress the infamous 2016 video, the one where he's seen chasing Cassie down a hallway, kicking her, beating the shit out of her, and eventually getting diffused by a hotel security guard by the name of Flores. So the prosecution claims that Combs wanted to suppress the evidence provided by the hotel video in order to prevent being arrested by the LAPD. The thing is, Cassie never pressed charges. It was just a matter of public image, public perception. Most celebrities want to maintain a certain kind of image that's positive, and this, of course, was a very negative thing. Again, later on, Cassie did blame this whole experience on drugs. So in any event, according to the prosecutors, here's how it went down. A few days after the incident, Combs learns about the existence of the security footage. He allegedly contacts Eddie Garcia, a member of the hotel's security staff, to keep the video from going public. According to prosecutors, Combs offers Garcia an initial payment of $50,000, but that amount grew closer to $90,000 or even $100,000 because Garcia needed to distribute some of this money to the other security personnel, such as his boss, who had access to the footage. This money was an incentive to get them to keep it quiet and not release it to the public. Agnofilo argues that this one's not a bribe in the legal sense. A bribe in the legal sense requires paying off a public law official or enforcement officer, a policeman, to influence an official act. And Garcia wasn't a cop. Flores was not a cop at the time. He later became a cop, and he is now working for the LAPD. He's a police officer. But the other part of the law is that if you are going to be accused of committing bribery, then you need to give money or something valuable to a potential witness, somebody who is going to either testify in court or testify against you. So you would pay for their silence or maybe a false testimony. But the thing is, this was back in 2016. I know Diddy is a man of many talents, but to see into the future, almost 10 years hence, I just don't see that happening. In other words, he was just looking to suppress the video, gave the money to Garcia, and then Garcia signed a non-disclosure agreement, which is not unusual for celebrities to do. But Agnifilo argued that this was not a bribe in the legal sense, and I agree. Because in the legal sense, under the federal law, bribery requires paying off a public official or a law enforcement officer to influence an official act. Well, he did not do that. All he wanted to do was to suppress the video to maintain and preserve his public image. So as soon as we saw this video surface, when it was played on CNN and then elsewhere, Diddy's reputation plummeted. He was dead in the water. It was a damning video and a damning piece of evidence, but he never caused bribery. Bribery, in this case, legally also means when you pay somebody who's basically a witness to testify falsely or not testify at all. And it has to be something that happens immediately. So within a narrow time frame. So we're talking about 2016. How in the heck is Diddy supposed to know that almost 10 years later, he is going to be facing charges, and this will be central to those charges and central to his losing his reputation. All I have to say is no bribery took place. In a long-winded way, no bribery took place. Now, as far as witness tampering goes, prosecutors claim that Combs tried to influence Mia, a former assistant and one of the key witnesses in the trial. The prosecution claimed that he tried to influence her through text messages and phone calls after his investigation began. In a telephone call, he's even said that he just wanted to talk to her to jar his memory, and that was it. He even has his assistant, D-Rock, contact Mia. She talked to him, but she never contacted Diddy. She never returned his calls, and that was pretty much that. So there was no intended witness tampering because there was no telephone call. There was nothing. However, the prosecution suggested that he was attempting to shape her testimony ahead of his trial. But the thing is, nothing happened. He was never able to get in touch with her. How can you say that he was witness tampering when he called the person and they didn't get back to them? I mean, you can imply things, but you will never understand his state of mind, especially at this. This is just really weird. So essentially, there was no threat, there was no coercion, there was no attempt to intimidate. So the defense argues that Combs was trying to jog his memory about events from years ago, not about obstructing justice. And the evidence points to this based on the text messages and recorded phone calls. So I think that the government is really, or the prosecution, is really trying to not just overreach. I mean, they're trying to create something out of nothing. So their narrative is fiction, and it shouldn't be. They should be operating based on facts, and clearly they're not. Now, this last one, drug possession with intent to distribute, I'm sure the prosecutors were salivating over this one. They wanted Combs to go down. They wanted to get their RICO, and they knew that this drug charge would clinch the deal. I'm sure that they could feel it. I'm sure this was their so-called wet dream, right? That way we'd have drug charges, they could have Mann Act, and they could get their RICO and put this poor guy away for life. So the prosecution claimed that Combs shared drugs from his Gucci bag stash. So there was always some mention of the Gucci bag. Basically, it had a lot of drugs in it, and these Gucci bag stash of drugs was used during the freak-offs, because recall, a lot of the freak-offs took place in hotels, and so you have to pack when you're going to a hotel, so don't forget the Gucci bag full of drugs, was the sentiment there. So the drugs that were in this Gucci bag were stuff like cocaine, Xanax, Molly, MDMA, ecstasy, Tootsie, cocaine, ketamine, and mushrooms or psilocybin. So this guy was serious. I mean, he had a lot of drugs. He was definitely a substance abuser, and he probably needs to enter some program if he hasn't already. But in any event, each amount of one of those substances, I'm sure, was just the smallest amount, just for his personal use. His mule, one of his assistants that would get drugs for him, said it was between $100 and $500 worth of substance of drugs. So that's definitely personal use. It's not kilos. It's not, $30,000 or $40,000 block of like cocaine or something meant for distribution. This guy just wanted to party. That's all he's trying to do, just have a good time partying. I personally don't do drugs. I personally don't advocate for drugs, but I'm just saying that some people do it, and they are not distributors because of it. Let's look at Brendan Paul. Brendan Paul was dubbed by the prosecution as Combs' drug mule. Ooh, he had a drug mule. So basically, this so-called drug mule was cleaning Combs' closet, saw a little bag of cocaine, put it in his pocket, forgot that he had it in his pocket, went to the Miami airport, was trying to get through, dog sniffed it, busted him, got busted on possession. A few months later, he was acquitted because the amount was too small. We're talking 0.7 grams of cocaine, okay? So 0.7 grams is equivalent to 700 milligrams. 700 milligrams is equal to about 2 aspirin. 2 aspirin are 650 milligrams, so it was just a little more than 2 aspirins. So let that sink in. So this is the prosecution saying, P. Diddy has a drug mule. He had 2 aspirins worth of cocaine. Like, what are you going to do with that? So anyway, it's good that Brendan Paul's charges were eventually dismissed because the quantity was so small. And that's the difference between the state laws regarding drugs and then this federal offense. The state charge, 700 milligrams, is considered personal use and it's a misdemeanor. So you basically pay a fine or something and that's pretty much that. But if he had had a hell of a lot more, let's say he had a kilo or something, or 2.2 pounds, that's a kilo, it would have constituted a felony with much more severe penalties. And that is the difference between state drug laws and the federal ones, because the federal guidelines were quantity does not matter. So the instructions to the jury was, if Combs has drugs, it doesn't matter what quantity, he is guilty of possession. And it's just really interesting when you think about quantity and you think about drug possession with the intent to distribute, which is what Combs was charged with. I mean, I'm sure members of the jury, just like many of us, have seen the show Locked Up Abroad. It's a popular show in which drug mules are usually caught, and they are caught with sizable amounts of drugs, kilos of drugs. You know, a kilo is 2.2 pounds. This show exemplifies the large quantity of drugs required for the intent to distribute in a more realistic and practical way. So let's face it, if you're going to distribute drugs, you do it in huge quantities or else it is not worth your while. However, the government says that if you possess drugs and you give one of the drugs, it doesn't have to be a sale, it could just be handing a drug over to someone else, that's considered distribution. So for example, according to this law, you could get busted if you were trying to help your friend. For example, if your friend, as well as you, take Xanax and your friend's prescription runs out and they cannot get a new prescription because they cannot get in touch with their doctor. So what do? They're about to have a panic attack. What do? So you, being the sensitive person that you are, take out a pill of Xanax from your stash or your prescription bottle. You hand it to your friend so they can experience relief from symptoms, and boom, there you go. You were in possession of a drug and you gave it to somebody. Does not matter the state of mind. It doesn't matter your intention or the circumstances. According to this federal law, you had drugs, you gave it, boom, you're guilty. Now, this was a charge that the jury actually sent a note to the judge to ask them to clarify this, because they were wondering if the recipient were to ask for a pill from somebody else, did that constitute distribution? And the answer was yes. So I think everybody was thinking about that. Members of the public who are following the trial, such as myself, we have active discussions about this, trying to figure out what the practical nature and logistics of it was. It's completely impractical, but it's large and broad and ambiguous because in order to take down the mob, you will need something like this. You have to be pretty ruthless. So, bottom line, after all this, the verdict on drug possession with intent to distribute, that charge failed. Verdict, not guilty. But again, you know, it's such a stretch, all these predicate acts. Another name for this podcast could have been Chasing the RICO, the government's failed attempt at RICO charge, or something to that effect. Ridiculous. By week 4, all the evidence was crumbling before our eyes through cross-examinations, careful cross-examinations, systematic cross-examinations, and examining the evidence and providing more evidence to show the context and to prove that the government was cherry picking. So anyway, not guilty on this charge. But just for perspective, in contrast to this charge against P. Diddy, I want to digress a bit and look at an actual RICO charge, an actual RICO case that was being tried at the same time as the Sean Combs supposed RICO case was taking place at the same courthouse, the Southern District of New York courthouse. Now, they were trying a case for a very serious RICO indictment or RICO charge. And I'm glad the government spent money on this trial to crack down on these individuals and ultimately send them to jail. So let's look at this. Let's look at this case. It is called Tren de Aragua. Okay, so it's U.S. versus Tren de Aragua, the location, Southern District of New York, unsealed April 25th. Now, overview, there were 27 co-conspirator defendants, including current and former members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, indicted under RICO. The charges included racketeering conspiracy, drug trafficking, sex trafficking, robbery, firearms offenses, and human trafficking. It is seen as a violent, transnational criminal enterprise involved in bringing young women from Venezuela to New York for forced prostitution, trafficking narcotics, committing murders, and extortion. The key features of the case included organization structure. It was clearly defined leadership and membership with Tren de Aragua and the splinter group Anti-Tren. They had scope and scale. There was multi-state operations, multi-million-dollar illicit profits, severe violence and exploitation, victim exploitation. Women were forcibly trafficked across borders for prostitution under threat of violence, alongside with widespread gun and trafficking offenses. So you see, you contrast this with the P. Diddy trial. Certainly, this one had organization. They had people committed to doing criminal acts. They had the intention. They had the structure. They had the pattern, the repeated pattern of doing this all the time. So they had all of the elements and more, but they were dedicated to criminality. It was not questionable. That was the nature of their business. They were not in entertainment, music, or clothing. They were into the trafficking of human beings and selling drugs. It is a terrible thing. I'm sure they had kilos of drugs that they had in possession with intent to distribute. And I bet you that was the case. If we look at the evidence and review the transcripts of this trial, I'm sure it will be the case. Now, let's contrast this to Combs' enterprise. Now that we know what a real RICO case looks like, what dangerous RICO organizations are like, let's contrast it to the Combs enterprise. Are there any parallels? Is there any overlap? No, there is not. This is the government trying really hard to accuse Combs of RICO. It's laughable. It's a joke. And Mark Agnifilo, in his closing arguments, was aware of how ridiculous this whole thing was. He was sarcastic, he made jokes, and he engaged the jury. And he did talk about government overreach, and he did talk about the selectivity of the government targeting Combs. And it almost looks like they made up evidence. They needed their RICO. They needed 8 predicate acts. And so they just stretched it so far. I think they were just banking on the fact that they are the government, that Sean Diddy Combs had that video. He is a rapper, and he may or may not be the most stand-up kind of character, because he tries to present himself as some sort of street person or thug or what have you. But then when you see some of these charges, it kind of is consistent. But bottom line is RICO does not fit, and it's just a huge stretch. So the fact that Agnifico was just folksy, he presented well, he gained the attention of the jury, he made them laugh, he made some solid points, he covered all of his points really well, and he just mentioned at the end of the day, be smart. Just because it's the government, it doesn't mean that you have to go along with this if it does not fit. If you think the evidence does not support the charge, then that's reasonable doubt. So he was very good. I'm looking in my notes because I'm a good observer, has a notebook. I have 3 notebooks. I just went through all of this. Basically, he was saying that you have to be careful. The government was very selective with Combs, and we don't need that from the government. Now, before the prosecution and the defense did have a conversation after the jury had left, prior to the closing arguments, prior to the jury instructions being given out, they decided to put limits on what could be said in the closing argument, and they couldn't be political. So I was hoping that the defense would actually say, why is the government spending $10 million, and I'm not exaggerating, to do this trial when there are gangs out there like Tren de Aragua and others who are doing serious crime in this city, in this state, and in this country. The other thing is with the $10 million, I mean, we do have a lot of other programs that could have definitely benefited from that money here in this city. So you have to really think about how our resources are being allocated. And I think this really matters. We really have to think about why this matters, what a real RICO case looks like. A real RICO case is a criminal network built on profit, hierarchy, and intimidation. So in contrast, the case against Sean Combs never rose to this level. His enterprise was dedicated to music, his clothing line, his alcohol brand, which he recently divested from. He had personal assistants who occasionally ran errands for him, bought drugs or made hotel reservations and stuff, as most personal assistants do. So it just shows why applying a RICO case is not appropriate. Other thoughts that I have, the RICO laws are good if you're trying to take down the mob, and that's good. I mean, it should stay in place. Basically, the charges should fit the crime. So as far as battery goes, the defense said that had he been hit with a battery charge because of Cassie, he would have pled guilty. And I think that the government should have charged him with sexual harassment after Mia had made this confession. But the thing is, they never did that. And I believe it's because these are lesser offenses. They are state offenses. And if you were to bring it to the federal level, which I doubt, probably no minimum sentencing. You'd probably get probation or a fine. So it's just not high profile enough, and it's not something that's part of the RICO predicate acts that they could use. We have to look at who benefits from this. My theory is that since these women don't work at fancy law firms where they get huge year-end bonuses for the work they do and the cases they win, they only benefit and grow professionally and get promoted because they work for the government for cases that they win. So they have to pick and choose cases in order to grow their stature and in order to get promoted and recognized. So why not bring a high-profile defendant, such as Sean Combs, and try to win a RICO, which is also more prestigious than just regular, straightforward charges. So this is why Sean Combs was targeted, and this is why they decided to hit him with a RICO. Now, I used to work for the government in Lower Manhattan, so I understand how these things work. There's no monetary award, but you can certainly advance your career through, casework and work in cases that you wind up getting on. So ultimately, the government is going to count this as a win, the verdict. Even though they didn't get their precious, beloved RICO, they managed to get a 1 count, and that was the Mann Act violation, or actually 2 counts of that. So they're going to call that a win. even though they basically lost all the other charges and they lost the RICO. So it's also like false accounting, if you ask me. So anyway, as far as sentencing goes, by the time the podcast is up and running in a day or two, we will know what the sentencing is. I predict a sentencing that will allow him to get out in 18 to 24 months with good behavior and other incentives. I took a bunch of averages. I reduced it by the fact that if he gets into a substance abuse program, that's minus 10%. If he gets into a batterer program, that's minus 10%. If he gets into a anger management program, which he needs, that's another 10%. And he gets out early on good behavior, as he has been a model prisoner at the MDC. Rumor has it, I talked to a police officer who knows somebody who works there. He just doesn't talk to anybody. He keeps a low profile. But again, if he were to get in a federal penitentiary and start teaching courses, seminars on business, entrepreneurship, or how to get a job, maybe discover some talent in the jail, people who can sing or rap. He can also maybe help the institution by starting a clothing brand label, just like they do in Oregon. There's a prison in Oregon, it's an Oregon State prison that actually has a clothing line for prisoners' clothing. I think that's the name of it. So it would be interesting to see that. It's a popular brand because it's very basic, but it's very durable, and it lasts for a long time. So people like quality, people like basics, people like things that are simple and uncomplicated, that have an enduring quality, classics. So I think that that is an option for Diddy. Another thing I think he should do or start when he's in jail is to write his memoirs. I think they could be fascinating. And he could also do a whole thing on business. I mean, I'm sure he has at least 3 books in him. His life story, his upbringing, how he made it in the entertainment industry, maybe some of the accusations, or maybe some self-confessions if he actually was in shootouts and gunfights like rumors have it. But who's going to confess to that? I mean, he's just trying to get by. You know, he's not a arms dealer. You know, I'm sure that is that the next charge? So in any event, I appreciate your listening to me. I'm sorry if I rambled on too much, but there's a lot that I want to say about this. And I think we should all take it seriously. Feel free to think about it. Come back later if you have more questions. And I would love to hear your questions, and we can have a dialogue. And I would be happy to answer anything about what it was like to observe the trial, to what it was like outside of the trial, or if you have any questions about the trial, or you just want to add some comments, if you work in law, if you've been in the criminal justice system yourself. So it's all very interesting. This is Angela McGuire with Crosstown Traffic, reporting from New York.